The night the old man almost froze to death started like a rumor on the wind, sharp and cold, the kind that sneaks under your jacket and won't leave. And by the time Bishop Kane heard it, the damage was already done, because Kane had spent 30 years teaching himself that some things you can't undo, you can only answer for them. And this was one of those things. A runaway kid curled around his father on a dead stretch of highway outside Cutter's Ridge, holding an old Hell's Angel together with nothing but his own skinny body and stubborn breath while the wind cut like knives. And Kane didn't know that yet, not fully, but he felt in his bones as he rode, the blacktop empty, moonlight sliding over chrome, memories riding shotgun whether he wanted them or not, memories of his own father coughing blood into a shop rag, of promises made too late, of nights when survival came down to who stayed and who walked away. And when he finally saw the scene, it punched the air out of him. The busted pickup half buried in snow, hazard lights blinking like a dying pulse, and beside it, slumped against the door, was Dutch Kane, once a terror on two wheels, now 80 years old and shaking, his hands blue, his breath ragged, and wrapped around him like a shield was a kid no more than 16, face raw from the cold, jacket torn, arms locked tight like if he let go the world would end, and Kane dismounted without a word, boots crunching, his heart loud in his ears, because he'd buried his mother last year, and he wasn't ready to bury his father too. And the kid looked up, eyes wild but steady, not begging, not asking, just daring anyone to take over. And Kane saw blood on the kid's knuckles and frost on his lashes, and something like resolve that didn't belong to children. And Dutch tried to speak but couldn't, and Kane dropped to his knees in the snow and took his father's face in his hands and whispered it was okay. He was here now, and the kid finally let go, collapsed, sideways, coughing, shaking, and Kane caught him too, because that's what leaders do when the world narrows to who's in front of you. And later, after the ambulance lights washed the road red and blue, and the kid sat on the bumper wrapped in a blanket, Kane learned his name was Eli, that he'd been running for weeks, that he'd seen the truck slide off the road and stopped, even though stopping is how you die when you're alone, that he'd stayed all night blocking the wind with his own body because the old man kept saying a name in his sleep, the same name Kane's worn on his back since he was 20, and something in Kane broke clean and sharp and then set hard as steel, because loyalty doesn't check ages and family isn't just blood, it's action. And when the paramedics said Dutch might make it because of the kid, Kane nodded once like a verdict had been reached. And when the cop on scene started asking questions with that bored, hungry look, Kane stood and said, "That's enough." And the cop hesitated because he knew who Kane was and who stood behind him even when they weren't there. And as the ambulance doors closed, Kane put his hand on Eli's shoulder and felt him flinch like he expected pain. And Kane said he did good, son, real good. And those words landed heavier than the snow. And before they loaded Eli up too, Kane leaned close and said, "No one's taking you tonight. Not from me." And the kid's eyes filled, but he didn't cry. Not yet, because some kids learn early you save that for later. And Kane rode back alone, the cold not touching him now, anger doing the job instead, thinking about the men who'd taught him that the world preys on the weak and the decent pay the price, thinking about promises, thinking about how fate has a way of knocking with someone else's fist. And by the time he reached the clubhouse, the lights were on like they'd been waiting, because word travels fast when it matters. And the room smelled of oil and coffee and old wood. And Kane stood in the doorway and said, "My father almost died tonight." And the noise died with it. And he told them about the kid, about the wind, about the night, about the way decency showed up where it wasn't supposed to, and no one interrupted because some stories you let finish. And before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And Kane went on, voice low, steady, saying the kids in the hospital, saying someone had been chasing him, saying there were marks on his arms that didn't come from weather. And as he spoke, he watched the faces of his brothers harden in that familiar way, the way they do when the world draws a line. And Kane finished by saying, "This isn't charity. This is a debt." And he didn't have to explain further, because every man in that room understood what it meant when a stranger stands guard over your blood. And later, alone in his office, Kane stared at an old photo of Dutch in his prime, laughing, fearless, and felt the weight of the years pressed down, and he made the call he'd been avoiding, the one that would pull old enemies into the light. Because somewhere out there was a reason a kid was running and a reason a cop's questions felt wrong. And Kane knew, with the cold certainty that had kept him alive this long, that the night on the highway was only the trigger, not the storm, and storms, once started, don't ask permission to finish. By morning, the clubhouse felt like a war room disguised as a garage. Engines quiet but tension humming. And Bishop Kane watched his brothers drift in one by one, each carrying the weight of what he'd said the night before. Because when a Kane debt gets spoken out loud, it doesn't fade with sleep, it sharpens. And first through the door was Rook, lean and watchful, the club's eyes on the street. A former long-haul trucker who noticed everything and trusted nothing, nodding once as he handed Kane a folded note with hospital updates scribbled in block letters. Dutch stable, but critical. Eli sedated and under observation. No next of kin listed. And Kane felt a strange mix of relief and anger settle in his chest. Relief they were alive. Anger that the world had made a kid earn survival like that. And behind Rook came Mercy, their medic, gray-bearded and calm, smelling faintly of antiseptic and coffee, saying the kid's lucky he didn't lose fingers, saying hypothermia doesn't forgive mistakes. And Kane listened because Mercy had pulled more brothers back from the edge than anyone alive. And then Bull filled the doorway, wide as a fridge, club enforcer, knuckles scarred like a road map, grin absent today, saying if someone put hands on that kid, he wanted names, not reasons. And Kane raised a hand, slow, because rage without direction wastes time. And last came Ash, strategist, numbers guy, the one who could turn chaos into steps, flipping open a laptop on the scar table. Like it belonged there, because in this club brains mattered as much as muscle. And Kane let the room settle, let the familiar banter die, because this wasn't about posturing, it was about lines crossed. And he told them what he'd learned since dawn, that Eli had been bounced through 3 foster homes in 2 years, that he'd run when a county contractor started using him for petty theft and beat him when he pushed back, that the same contractor worked security for Sheriff Halvorson's private interests, and the name landed heavy because Halvorson wasn't just a cop, he was the cop, smiling for cameras, squeezing towns dry. And Ash said quietly that Halvorson had been cozy with a cartel transport line running through Cutter's Ridge, small time at first, then bigger, and Rook added that the night Eli ran, a warehouse fire covered a shipment loss, bodies never found, questions buried, and Kane felt the shape of it click together. Because corruption always hides behind order. And the room filled with that low murmur that comes when men realize the fight won't be clean. And Mercy asked what the plan was for the kid, and Kane didn't hesitate. Said Eli stays under our protection. No paperwork, no deals, because he'd earned that by doing what no one else did. And Bull smiled then, slow and mean, and said good, because whoever scared him would come sniffing. And Ash cautioned that Halvorson wouldn't move openly. That pressure would come sideways, CPS visits, traffic stops, warrants that appear from thin air. And Kane nodded, knowing the game, knowing the cost, and said then we play it smarter because loyalty isn't loud, it's precise. And they spent the next hours mapping routes, setting watches, assigning roles like they'd done 100 times before, Rook on lookout rotation near the hospital, Mercy coordinating with a nurse who owed him a favor, Ash digging into shell companies, Bull ready but leashed. Because the best punch is the one you don't throw yet. And through it all, Kane felt the old scar in his chest ache. The one left by a brother he couldn't save years back when he chose speed over patience. And he promised himself he wouldn't make that mistake again. And when they broke, Kane rode alone to the hospital, helmet under his arm. The hall's too bright, too clean, smelling of bleach and fear, and he stood by Dutch's bed listening to the machines breathe for him, thinking about all the nights the old man had ridden into weather worse than this, and come back laughing. And Kane leaned in and said, "Stay with me, old man, because I still need you to yell at me." And then he went down the hall to Eli's room, where the kid lay small in a big bed, bruises blooming like ugly flowers on his arms, and Kane sat, saying nothing, because presence is its own language. And when Eli woke, he flinched again until he recognized Kane, and Kane told him straight that he wasn't going anywhere, that some men take promises seriously, and Eli whispered that the sheriff would come, that he always did, and Kane said let him, and meant it. And outside, Halverson did come, not in uniform, but in a press coat and a politician smile, stopping at the nurse's station with a badge flashed just enough, asking questions just soft enough, and Rook watched from the vending machines, memorizing the way the man leaned, the way his eyes skipped over rooms like inventory, and Rook texted Ash one word, him, and Ash replied with coordinates and timing, because the Brotherhood moved like a single animal when it mattered. And Kane met Halvorsen in the hallway, two power centers passing in fluorescent light, and the sheriff said he was concerned about a missing youth, and Kane said the kid was safe, and the smile thinned, and Halvorsen warned about interference, about laws, about consequences, and Kane stepped closer, voice low, saying consequences work both ways. And for a moment the mask slipped, and something cold looked back, something that promised this wouldn't end with words. And Kane watched him leave, knowing the clock had started. And back at the clubhouse that night, the bikes rolled in one by one, engines echoing like thunder in a storm that hadn't broken yet. And Kane stood at the head of the table and told them Halvorsen had shown his hand, and that meant the next move would be dirty, and no one argued, because the Brotherhood doesn't argue when the road narrows. They choose a lane and ride. And as the night wore on in plans, locked in a place, Kane felt the weight of leadership settle heavy and familiar, knowing that protecting one kid might burn bridges, start fires, cost blood, but also knowing that some debts define who you are if you pay them or not. And as dawn crept in pale and uncertain, the sense of unavoidable conflict hung thick, because the enemy was real, patient, and backed by badges and money. And Kane knew, deep down where instincts live, that by choosing the kid, they'd chosen a fight that wouldn't stop until someone fell. The collision came faster than Kane expected and slower than he feared, creeping in like a fog that looks thin until you're already lost in it, because by the third night the pressure wasn't loud, it was surgical. CPS showed up at the hospital with papers that smelled like fresh ink and old favors. A judge's signature rushed through after hours, and Mercy stalled them just long enough for Ash to copy everything and send it down the line. And what they saw made Kane's jaw lock. Emergency custody, granted to the county, citing risk of gang influence. The kind of language that kills truth by sounding reasonable. And Kane felt the familiar anger rise, but kept it buried, because rage is what men like Halvorsen feed on. And instead he ordered a quiet extraction, not a rescue. An exit, because Eli wasn't a prize. He was a responsibility. And the plan moved smooth at first, Rook shadowing the corridors, Mercy signing off on a transfer that never happened, Bull lifting the kid gentle as a father. despite the hands that had broken bones, and Kane walking point like he always did, feeling the weight of every step. And they were 2 blocks from the safe house when the ambush snapped shut, cruisers boxing them in without sirens, black SUVs sliding sideways. And Halvorsen stepped out smiling like he'd rehearsed it, saying this didn't have to be ugly. And Kane thought of Dutch coughing in the night and Eli shaking in the snow, and answered that it already was, and the street filled with shouting, guns not raised, but present, the threat thick, and Ash murmured in Kane's ear that warrants were coming down for weapons violations and conspiracy, that the paperwork was clean enough to choke on, and Kane realized then this wasn't about the kid alone. This was about breaking the club, using compassion as the hook, and when Halvorsen ordered Bull cuffed, Kane saw the choice in front of him like a fork in the road. One path leading to surrender and slow death by law, the other to open war. And before he could decide, betrayal cut in sharp and close, because it was Rook who stepped forward, hands up, voice steady, saying he'd cooperate. And the word hit Kane harder than any punch, memories flashing of miles ridden together, secrets shared, lives saved, and Kane's first instinct was denial until Rook met his eyes, and Kane saw it wasn't fear there, it was calculation, and Rook let himself be taken. And as the cruisers pulled back, Halvorsen leaned close to Kane and whispered, "That loyalty breaks easier than bones," and drove off laughing, leaving Kane in the street with the kid and the weight of a brother's choice crushing his chest. And later, in the safe house, Eli sat silent on the floor, knees pulled up, watching men who looked unbreakable bleed frustration into the walls. And Kane finally spoke, saying Rook wasn't a rat. He was a knife. Because Rook had been their lookout for years, and he wouldn't hand himself over unless there was a reason. And Ash confirmed it, saying Rook had slipped a drive in his pocket during the arrest, data already syncing. And when they cracked it open, the room went quiet because there was ledger after ledger tying Halvorsen to cartel shipments, shell charities, private prisons, names that would burn half the county if they saw daylight. And also a note, short and plain, saying, "I'll buy you time, use it." And Kane felt the guilt hit then, hot and choking, because leadership means asking men to walk in a fire. And sometimes they do it before you can stop them. And the clock was ticking now, because Rook was inside and Halvorsen wouldn't waste the opportunity, and Kane ordered the move, not loud, not fast, but exact, because exposure was the weapon, and they split, Ash pushing the data to a reporter who still remembered what truth looked like, Mercy prepping go bags and burner phones, Bull loading up with that quiet focus that meant he was ready to die if needed. And Kane took a moment alone with Eli, kneeling so they were eye to eye, telling him none of this was his fault, telling him some adults choose wrong and make kids pay, and Eli asked if Rook would be okay. And Kane swallowed and said Rook chose this like he did on that road. And sometimes choosing means getting hurt. And the kid nodded, older than his years, and said he wanted to help. And Kane almost said no, then remembered the snow and the wind and the way courage shows up uninvited. And instead said stay alive, that's how you help. And the first blow landed at dawn. Headlines exploding, Halvorsen's face everywhere, denial statements issued. And then the counterstrike came hard because power never goes quietly, and cartel shooters rolled into Cutter's Ridge under cover of night, hitting a warehouse they thought was the clubhouse, and found nothing but empty space and a message burned into the wall, and the town woke to sirens and fear. And Kane stood on a ridge watching smoke rise, knowing this was the point of no return. And when word came that Rook had been moved off book, not logged, Kane felt the decision lock, because there are lines you don't let men disappear behind, and he called the meet himself, choosing the old quarry where truths echo and bodies don't get found. And he rode in with Bull and Ash, the night thick and electric, headlights cutting through dust, and Halvorsen was there with cartel muscle, confident, smug, holding Rook between them, bruised but breathing, and Halvorsen started, talking about deals and futures and how this could all end clean. And Kane listened, really listened, because sometimes the truth slips when men think they've won. And when Halvorsen admitted he'd use kids as runners because no one looks twice, Kane felt something cold settle, and he nodded. And that nod was the signal, because Ash had already sent the final file live, timestamps and all, and sirens wailed in the distance. Not county this time, but state and federal, and the cartel men. Realized too late they'd been sold out, and chaos erupted, shots fired, dust, and shouting. And in the confusion, Bull took a round meant for Kane and went down hard. And Kane dragged Rook free as Ash covered them. And they escaped into the dark with the sound of the old world collapsing behind them. And later, hiding out as dawn broke red and unforgiving, Kane knelt beside Bull as mercy worked, blood everywhere. And Rook apologized once before passing out, and Kane said nothing because forgiveness is sometimes silent. And as helicopters thudded overhead and the town held its breath, Kane knew the collision had happened, and whatever came next would carve them all differently. The consequences came heavy and slow, like thunder you hear after the lightning has already split the sky, and Kane felt them in every breath as the sun climbed, painting the dust and blood the same tired gold. Because Bull lived but barely, stitched together by mercy's steady hands and stubborn luck. And Rook survived too, though the marks on him would never fade. And as the radios crackled with news of arrests and sealed indictments and federal task forces pouring into Cutter's Ridge, Kane knew the story the world would hear would be clean and sharp and missing the truth between the lines, missing the nights and choices and the cost paid in flesh. And when Halvorsen finally fell, it wasn't with a gunshot or a scream, but with cuffs clicking cold around his wrists in a courthouse hallway, cameras flashing, his smile gone, eyes hollow, and Kane watched from a distance, hood up, feeling no joy, because justice without celebration is still justice. But it doesn't heal everything, and the cartel scattered like rats from a flood, some caught, some gone, leaving behind burned routes and empty promises, and Cutter's Ridge tried to pretend it had always been clean. And through it all, Eli stayed close, quiet, absorbing, because kids learn fast when the world shows its teeth. And Kane found himself checking on him in the mornings, making sure he ate, making sure he slept, saying little, because guidance doesn't always come in speeches. Sometimes it's just showing up again and again. And Dutch woke 2 days later, eyes clear for the first time in months. And when Kane leaned in, the old man smiled and said, "You look tired, son." And Kane laughed, a short, broken sound, and said, "You always said sleep was for people without responsibilities." And Dutch squeezed his hand weak but sure, saying, "I heard about the boy, saying you did right." And those words landed deeper than any metal, because Kane had chased approval his whole life without knowing it. And outside the hospital, the club gathered, smaller now, quieter, some faces missing, and Kane addressed them plain, saying what they'd done would echo, saying there would be scrutiny and loss and nights when the road felt longer, and asking if anyone regretted it. And no one spoke, because silence could be an answer too. And Bull, pale but grinning, said, "Next time let me take the second bullet." And Mercy told him to shut up, and the sound of laughter was thin but real. And weeks passed, and the town settled into a new, uneasy normal. CPS backed off quietly. Lawsuits piled up, and Kane used every favor he had to make sure Eli didn't disappear back into the cracks. And when the paperwork finally came through, guardianship signed and sealed, Cain felt the weight shift, not lift, but settle into something he could carry, and Eli stood in the clubhouse doorway, one evening watching the bikes roll in, eyes wide. And Cain told him the rules, simple ones, about honesty and showing up and never using fear as a shortcut. And the kid nodded, serious, and said he wouldn't waste it. And Cain believed him, because he'd seen what the kid did when no one was watching. And Rook healed slow, quieter than before, spending hours on the roof looking out of the highway like he was mapping a future 1 mile at a time. And one night he apologized again, and Cain finally answered, saying loyalty isn't about never leaving. It's about knowing when to walk into the fire alone. And Rook nodded, tears slipping free. And that was that. And as autumn came, Cain rode with Dutch on a clear afternoon. The old man on trike now, stubborn as ever, wind gentler this time. And they stopped where the road bent toward the mountains. And Dutch said, "You can't save everyone." And Cain said, "I know." And Dutch replied, "But you can save some." And the sun dipped low, and Cain felt the long arc of it all, the choices stacking up into a life. And he knew there would be consequences still waiting, because the world keeps score even when you win. But he also knew this, that on a frozen night, a kid chose to stand between an old man and death. And that choice had rippled outward, breaking bad men and binding good ones tighter. And Cain thought about the future, about the roads yet to ride, about Eli growing into his own man, about a club scarred but standing. And he didn't look for redemption anymore, because he'd learned something harder and truer. That redemption isn't a finish line, it's a direction. And as the engines roared back to life and the lights of Cutter's Ridge flickered on, Cain rode with his brothers, not clean, not untouched, but honest about the cost, carrying the consequences like a badge you don't polish. And that was enough for now. If you like this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep bringing you powerful stories like this. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and let us know which part of the story hit you the hardest. Your support means more than you know.